The Youth, the Beats, and Right-Wing Anarchists. Excerpted from The Beau and the Club. Julius Evola. 1968. Narrated by Skeptical Waves. Much, indeed, too much, has been written on the issue of the new generation and of young people. In most cases, the topic does not deserve the interest it has received. The importance which is sometimes assigned to youth in general today, and which finds its counterpart in a sort of devaluation of all those who are not young, is absurd. No doubt, we are living in an age of dissolution. The increasingly prevailing condition, therefore, is that of the rootless person, for whom society has lost all meaning, as have the norms that used to govern life. Besides, for the age just before our own, which still endures in certain places, such norms merely coincided with those of the bourgeois world and morals. Naturally, the youth in particular have grown weary of this situation, so from this perspective it may be legitimate to address certain issues. Still, it is necessary to draw certain distinctions and to consider, first of all, the case in which the situation in question is experienced merely passively, and not by virtue of any active initiative of one's own, as may have been the case with the occasional intellectually oriented and individualist rebel in the past. A new generation, therefore, is simply accepting the state of affairs. It shows no real concern and makes foolish use of its unfettered condition, so to speak. When these young people claim that they are misunderstood, the only answer one can give them is that there is simply nothing to understand about them, that, if a normal order were in force, it would only be a matter of curtly putting them in their place, as one does with children when their foolishness becomes annoying, invasive, and impertinent. The alleged nonconformism of some of their attitudes, which are actually quite banal, reflects a sort of trend, a new convention. It is the very opposite of an expression of freedom. Many of the phenomena we have examined in the previous pages, such as the taste for vulgarity and certain new social mores, may largely be attributed to this youth. Examples would include the fanatic, male and female, fans of howlers, those epileptic folk singers, and, at present, of the collective puppet show known as Yee Yee Sessions and of this or that album, with all that such interests entail in terms of behavior. Their lack of any sense of the ridiculous makes it impossible to exert any influence upon them, so one can only leave them to their own devices and foolishness. One should consider that if any polemic with regard to things such as the sexual emancipation of minors or the sense of family were to appear among this type of youth, it would have no impact at all. As the years go by, the need for most of them to face the material and economic problems of life will no doubt ensure that this youth, having become adult, will adapt to the professional, productive and social routines of the contemporary world, thereby essentially passing from one form of nothingness to another. So there is no real problem. This type of youth, defined by age alone, for one can hardly speak here of certain possibilities characteristic of youth in an inner, spiritual sense, is particularly common in Italy. Federal Germany presents a very different phenomenon. The foolish and degenerated forms just mentioned are far less widespread there. The new generation would appear to have calmly accepted the idea of an existence in which no concerns should be raised, of a life about whose meaning or purpose one should not wonder. This generation is simply concerned with enjoying the comforts and eases offered by the new development of Germany. We may refer to this type of youth as being one without concerns, a type which may have shed many conventions and acquired new freedoms, without creating any conflicts, on a two-dimensional level of factuality, foreign to any higher interest in myths, disciplines or ideals. This is probably only a transitional phase for Germany, because if we turn to consider countries that have gone further in the same direction, countries almost completely steeped in the atmosphere of a welfare society, where life is safe and everything is rationally regimented, we may refer in particular to Denmark, Sweden, and to some extent Norway too, we will notice that, from time to time, reactions take place in the form of violent and unexpected outbursts. These mainly concern the youth. In these cases, the phenomenon becomes more interesting and may be worth examining. In order to grasp the most typical forms of this phenomenon, it is necessary to turn to America and, to some extent, England. In America, phenomena of spiritual trauma and revolt have already emerged on a wide scale among the new generation. I am referring to that generation which has been given the name of Beat Generation and which I have already discussed in the previous pages, Beats or Beatniks, also known as hipsters. They have been the representatives of a sort of anarchistic and antisocial existentialism, a sort more practical than intellectual, certain insignificant literary expressions aside. At the time of this writing, the movement is no longer en vogue or flourishing, it has practically disappeared from the scene or dissolved. Nonetheless, it retains a certain significance, because this phenomenon is intrinsically connected to the very nature of the last civilization. So long as this civilization endures, similar manifestations are bound to appear, albeit in different forms and under different names. In particular, as American society, more than any other, embodies the limits and the reductio ad absurdum of the entire contemporary system, the beat forms of the phenomenon of revolt have acquired a special paradigmatic character, and, of course, they should not be regarded in the same terms as that foolish youth that has just been discussed, chiefly with reference to Italy. From my perspective, a brief study of certain issues within this context is justified, because I agree with the claim made by some beats that, contrary to what psychiatrists, psychoanalysts and social workers believe, in a society and civilization such as ours, and especially the American one, it is generally in the rebel, the misfit and the antisocial person that the healthy man is to be found. In an abnormal world, all values are inverted. It is precisely the one who appears abnormal in relation to the existing milieu who is most likely to be normal and to preserve some vital energy. I cannot agree at all with those who would like to rehabilitate such individuals, whom they regard as sick, and to readapt them to society. One psychoanalyst, Robert Lindner, had the courage to state this explicitly. From our point of view, the only problem concerns the definition of what we might call the right-wing anarchist. We will examine the distance that separates this type from the problematic orientation that almost invariably distinguishes the non-conformism of beats and hipsters. The starting point, which is to say the condition triggering the revolt of the beats, is evident. Their target is a system that, without taking totalitarian political forms, stifles life and damages personality. They sometimes bring up the issue of physical insecurity in the future, as they see the very existence of mankind as threatened by the prospects of a nuclear war, which are blown up to apocalyptic proportions. But what they chiefly feel is the danger of spiritual death inherent in any adaptation to the current system and to its variously conditioning power, heteroconditioning. America is described as a rotten country, developing cancer in every one of its cells, passivity, conformity, anxiety, and boredom, its three characteristics. In such a climate, the condition of being rootless, a unit lost in the lonely crowd, is very vividly experienced. Society, an empty, meaningless word. Traditional values have been lost, the new myths have been debunked, and this demythologization undermines all new hopes, freedom, social revolution, peace, nothing but hypocritical lies. The prospect of self-alienation as the ordinary condition is a real threat. Here, however, one can already point to the most important difference from the right-wing anarchist type. The beat does not react or rebel from a positive standpoint, which is to say, by having a precise idea of what a normal and sensible order would be, and firmly keeping to certain fundamental values. He reacts against the prevailing situation as though by instinct, in a confused existential way reminiscent of certain biological reactions. By contrast, the right-wing anarchist knows what he wants, and has grounds for saying no. The beat, in his chaotic revolt, not only lacks any such grounds, but would probably reject them were they shown to him. Hence, the definition rebel without a flag or rebel without a cause fits him well. This implies a fundamental weakness, in that the beats and hipsters who are so wary of being heteroconditioned, that is to say, controlled by external forces, ultimately run precisely this risk, insofar as their attitudes, as mere reactions, are provoked by the situation at hand. If anything, cold detachment would be a more coherent attitude. Therefore, leaving aside the outwardly directed protest and revolt of the beat, when this type considers the actual problem of his interpersonal life and seeks to resolve it, he inevitably finds himself on slippery ground. Lacking a concrete inner center, he throws himself into the fray, often driven by impulses which, instead of pressing him forward, make him regress, as he strives to fill the emptiness of a meaningless life in all possible ways. An illusionary solution had been found by one of the forerunners of the beats, Thoreau, who had resurrected the Rousseau-esque myth of the natural man and of the flight into nature, an all too simplistic and, ultimately, insipid formula. Then there are those who have taken the route of a new and cruder form of bohemian living, of nomadism and vagrancy, as in the case of Kerouac's characters, of the disorder and unpredictability of an existence that shuns all preordained lines of action and all discipline, as in the case of Henry Miller's early, party autobiographical novels, in an attempt to grasp the fullness of life at every moment, burning consciousness of the present, with neither good nor evil. The situation becomes even more serious when extreme solutions are adopted, when an attempt is made to fill one's inner emptiness, to feel real and to display a higher freedom, the self under no law or obligation, through violent or even criminal actions which are conceived not just as acts of extreme resistance and protest against the established order, against what is normal and rational, but as a means to find self-confirmation. The moral basis of gratuitous crimes has been affirmed along these lines, which is to say crimes carried out without any material or passionate motives, but simply out of a desperate need for value, To prove to oneself that one is a man, that one is not afraid of oneself, as a gamble with death and the afterlife. The use of everything frenetic, irrational and violent, the frenetic desire to create or destroy, may be understood in much the same terms. Here the illusory and equivocal nature of this kind of solution emerges quite clearly. It is evident that in such cases the search for a heightened vital feeling almost invariably serves as an illusory substitute for a real sense of the self. Besides, it is worth noting that extreme and irrational acts are not limited to things such as going out into the streets and shooting the first person one meets, as André Breton once proposed to the Surrealists, or raping one's younger sister, but also includes acts such as, for instance, giving away or destroying everything one owns, and risking one's life to save a foolish stranger. It is a matter of being able to discern whether what one regards as a gratuitous extreme act actually attests to and realizes a superior freedom, or whether it is instead driven by hidden impulses to which one is enslaved. A serious misunderstanding on the part of anarchist individualists, generally speaking, is constituted by the idea that one is being oneself, free from bonds, when one is in fact enslaved to oneself. Herbert Gould's observation with regard to those cases in which this self-examination is missing is certainly correct. The hipster is victim of the most hopeless condition of slavery, the slave who does not know that he is a slave and is proud of his slavery, calling it freedom. There is more to this. Many intense experiences that can give the beat a fleeting sense of reality ultimately make him even less real as they condition him. Wilson very clearly brings this situation into light through one of the characters of his aforementioned book, someone who, in a rather beat setting, carries out a series of sadistic murders of women in order to become reintegrated and escape frustration, because one has been defrauded of one's right to be a god, but in the end turns out to be a shattered, unreal being. He's like a man with paralysis who needs stronger and stronger stimulants. He doesn't care anymore. I thought that murder was only an expression of revolt against the modern world and its mechanisms, because the more one speaks of order and society, the higher the crime rate rises. I thought his crimes were but an act of defiance. Instead, that was not at all the case. He kills for the same reason that drives an alcoholic to drink, because he cannot do without it. The same also applies, of course, to any other extreme experience. In passing, in order to draw further precise distinctions, it is worth mentioning the fact that the world of tradition too was familiar with the so-called left-hand path, a path I have already discussed elsewhere. It includes breaking the law, destruction and the orgiastic experience in various forms, yet starting from a positive, sacred and sacrificial orientation that is directed upwards, towards the transcendence of all limits. This is the opposite of the pursuit of violent sensations merely because one is internally shattered and unstable, in an attempt to somehow remain on one's feet. The title of Wilson's book, Ritual in the Dark, is most appropriate. It almost conveys the idea of celebrating in the darkness and gloom what, in a different context, might have constituted a rite of transfiguration. Likewise, the beats often make use of certain drugs, seeking thereby to induce a rupture, an opening beyond ordinary consciousness. This, at any rate, according to the intentions of the best among them. But even one of the movement's leading representatives, Norman Mailer, has acknowledged the gamble which drug use entails. Alongside the higher clarity, the new, fresh and original perception of reality, by now unknown to common man, to which some aspire by the use of drugs, there is the danger of artificial paradises, of surrendering to forms of ecstatic delight, intense sensations and even visions, devoid of any spiritual or revealing content, which are followed by a state of depression once one returns to normality, thus only aggravating the existential crisis. What makes the difference here is, once again, the fundamental attitude of one's being. This almost invariably determines the action of certain drugs, in one sense or another. Confirmation of this comes from the effects of mescaline, as described by Aldous Huxley, an author already acquainted with traditional metaphysics, who draws an analogy with certain experiences of high mysticism, as opposed to the utterly banal effects described by Zaehner, an author I have already mentioned when criticizing Cut It, who sought to repeat Huxley's experiences, with the aim of controlling them, but starting from a completely different personal equation and attitude. Now, since the beat presents himself as a profoundly traumatized being who has thrown himself into the confused pursuit of something, he cannot expect anything really positive from the use of drugs. The contrary alternative will almost inevitably prevail, thus reversing any initial effects. Besides, the problem is not resolved by fleeting openings into reality, following which one finds oneself plunged back into a meaningless life. That prerequisites for venturing on this ground are lacking is also made apparent by the fact that the vast majority of beats and hipsters were young people who lacked the required maturity and who rejected all forms of self-discipline as a matter of principle. Some people have claimed that what the beats, or at any rate some of them, were seeking, deep down, was a new religion. Mailer, who stated "I want God to show me his face," even claimed that they were the harbingers of a new religion, that their excesses and revolts were transitional forms, which tomorrow could give rise to a new religion, like Christianity. All this sounds like nonsense today, now that it is possible to draw an assessment and no developments of the sort are in sight. Certainly, these forces lack precisely superior and transcendent points of reference like those of religions, which might provide support and a right orientation. They are searching for a faith that will save them, someone has said, but according to Mailer, God is in danger of dying, the reference here being to the God of Western theistic religion. Thus so-called mystic beats have looked elsewhere, they have been drawn to Eastern metaphysics, and especially Zen, as already mentioned in another chapter. However, with regard to this last point there are grounds for suspicion as to the motivations involved. Zen has exerted an influence on the individuals in question, particularly as a doctrine promising sudden and spontaneous, enlightening openings onto reality, with so-called satori, which may be produced through the undermining and rejection of all rational superstructures, through pure irrationality, the ruthless tearing down of every idol, and possibly the use of violent means. It is easy to see how all this might appeal to the young, rootless Westerner who cannot put up with any discipline and leads a reckless, rebellious life. But the truth is that Zen tacitly presupposes a previous orientation, connected to an age-old tradition, and that harsh trials are not ruled out. We only need to read the biographies of certain Zen masters. Suzuki, who was the first to introduce these doctrines in the West, has literally spoken of a baptism of fire as preparation to Satori. Arthur Rimbaud spoke of a method of becoming a seer through the systematic derangement of the senses, and the possibility cannot be excluded that, in a completely, mortally reckless life, in which one advances on his own, without any guidance, openings of the sort alluded to by Zen may take place. But these would always be exceptions, almost miraculous occurrences, as if certain individuals were predestined, or were under the protection of a good genius. One may suspect that the reason behind the attraction that Zen and similar doctrines exert on the beats lies rather in the fact that these doctrines provide a sort of spiritual justification for their inclination towards a purely negative anarchy, towards the lack of restraint, while allowing them to avoid the primary task, which in their case would be to give themselves an inner form. This confused need to achieve a higher, super-rational point of reference, and, as someone has noted, to grasp the secret call of being, is completely misdirected when this being is confused with life, according to theories such as those of Jung and Reich. This is also the case when one sees in the sexual orgasm and in giving oneself over to the sort of degenerate and frenzied Dionysianism sometimes offered by Negro jazz other suitable paths for feeling real and getting in touch with reality. With regard to sex, I should repeat here what I have already stated in Chapter 12, when examining the perspectives of the apostles of the sexual revolution. One of the characters in Wilson's aforementioned novel wonders whether the need for a woman is only the need to regain that intensity for a moment, whether a higher impulse, towards a higher freedom, is not unconsciously channeled into the sexual drive. This question is a legitimate one. As has already been noted, the non-biological and non-sensualist but, in a sense, transcendent conception of sexuality actually finds specific and significant antecedents in traditional teachings. However, it is necessary to turn here to the issue I have examined in Eros and the Mysteries of Love, where I have highlighted the ambivalence of the sexual experience, which is to say both the positive possibilities it encloses and the regressive, derealizing and conditioning ones. Now, the starting point is a sort of existential anguish, so much so that the beat seems to be obsessed with the idea of failing to attain the perfect orgasm, according to the aforementioned views of Wilhelm Reich, and, partly, those of D.H. Lawrence, who claim to see in sex a means to merge the primordial energy of life, taken for being and the spirit. There are therefore grounds for thinking that the negative and dissipating aspects of the sexual experience will predominate, once again, because the existential prerequisites for the opposite course are missing. Sex and the uncontrollable force of the orgasm will control the self and not vice versa, as ought to be the case for all of this to serve as a path. As in the case of drugs, experiences of this sort, which, incidentally, may also play a role in the left-hand path, are not suitable for a decentered young generation. As for complete sexual freedom, it is trivial as a mere expression of revolt and nonconformity, and has nothing to do with the issue of spirituality. The negative aspects are brought better into focus by the fact that the beats turn jazz into a sort of religion and see it as a positive means to overcome their alienation, to grasp moments of liberating intensity. The Negro origins of jazz, which continue to serve as the basis even of the more elaborate forms of these rhythms, as in the case of swing and bebop, are not seen as a matter of concern, but as something valuable. In another chapter I have already mentioned, as an aspect of the spiritual negrification of America, The fact that in a famous essay Mailer assimilates the position of the beat to that of the Negro, he speaks of the former as a white Negro, expressing appreciation for certain aspects of the irrational, natural, instinctual and violent Negro nature. Moreover, the beats have openly displayed a tendency towards promiscuity even on the sexual level, with white girls challenging prejudices and conventions by giving themselves to Negroes. As for jazz, one can identify in its milieux an assimilation of certain elements that is more serious than the infatuation displayed by the foolish non-American youth mentioned at the beginning of this chapter. But this is precisely what makes the phenomenon more dangerous. There are reasons to believe that the identification with frenzied and elementary rhythms produces forms of downward self-transcendence, to use an expression previously explained, forms of subpersonal regression to what is merely vital and primitive, partial possessions that, following moments of violent intensity and quasi-ecstatic outbursts, leave one feeling even more empty and estranged from reality than before. If we consider the atmosphere of Negro rites and group ceremonies of which jazz is reminiscent in its original and earliest forms, that direction seems quite evident, as in the case of the macumba and in the candomblé practiced by Black Americans. It is obvious that we are dealing with forms of demonism and trance, with obscure possessions which have nothing to do with any access to a higher realm. Unfortunately, there is little more to be gleaned from an analysis of what beats and hipsters have sought, on an individual and existential level, as a counterpart to a legitimate revolt against the present system, to fill a void and resolve a spiritual problem. The crisis endures. Only in exceptional cases does one find anything that, in the case of a right-wing anarchist, may carry positive value. Ultimately, the issue here is the human material. Insofar as a new generation may choose to seriously follow the course of practical nonconformism, demythologization and cold detachment from all bourgeois institutions, there is nothing to object. Following the suggestions of certain representatives of the beat generation, I have not dismissed their movement as a passing trend, but have rather focused on it in some detail, on account of its distinguishing aspects. The issues it addresses are a natural expression of the current age. The movement thus preserves its significance even though its specific forms have ceased to exist in America or to exert any real appeal. After all this, I would like to briefly consider a specific case related to the younger generation. There are young people who are rebelling against the socio-political situation in Italy while, at the same time, showing an interest in what I usually refer to as the world of tradition. While they oppose left-wing forces and ideologies, which are making dangerous inroads, on a practical level, these youths also take an interest, at least in theory, in the teachings and disciplines of ancient lore in more positive terms than was the case with the beat's confused approaches. What we have, then, are potentially available forces. The problem is finding suitable guidelines to lend their activity the right direction. My book Ride the Tiger, which has been described as a manual for the right-wing anarchist, only partially solves this problem, since it is essentially addressed to a specific differentiated type, with a high level of maturity, something which all too often people have failed to observe. So the guidelines provided in this book are not always suitable for the category of young people I have just mentioned. The first advice to give these youths is to be wary of forms of interest and enthusiasm that might only be biologically conditioned, which is to say connected to age. One must see whether these young people will preserve the same outlook once they approach adulthood and come to face the concrete problems of life. Unfortunately, experience has shown me that this is only rarely the case. At the threshold of 30, say, few keep their position. I have spoken of a kind of youth which is not merely biological, but also has an inner, spiritual aspect, and hence is not conditioned by age. This higher youth may also manifest itself through biological youth. It is characterized not by idealism, an inflated, equivocal term, since the capacity to undermine ideals to the point of approaching point zero of established values is a trait which these young people ought to share in common with other currents of a very different nature. I would rather speak of a certain capacity for enthusiasm and vigor, unconditional devotion, and detachment from bourgeois life and purely material and self-serving interests. The task, then, would be to assimilate these inclinations and make them one's own, so that they may become permanent qualities and counter the opposite influences to which one becomes fatally exposed with the passing of the years, and the need to face the concrete problems of contemporary life. As for nonconformism, the first prerequisite is a strictly anti-bourgeois conduct of life. In his early days Ernst Jünger did not hesitate to write, "Better a criminal than a bourgeois." I am not saying that this formula should be taken literally, but it does suggest a general orientation. In everyday life, moreover, one must look out for the snares of sentimental matters, marriage, the family and any other surviving structures belonging to a society whose absurdity one acknowledges. This is a crucial benchmark. By contrast, In the case of the type in question, certain experiences which we have seen to be problematic in the case of beats and hipsters may not pose the same dangers. As a counterpart to all this, the type in question ought to display an inclination toward self-discipline in free forms, removed from any social or pedagogical requirement. In the case of young people, what is at stake is their development, in the most objective sense of the term. A difficulty emerges because every development entails certain values as a point of reference, but the young man in revolt rejects all values, all the morals of existing society, and especially bourgeois society. A distinction must be drawn in this respect. There are certain values which have a conformist character and a purely exterior, social justification, not to mention those values which have come to be regarded as such because their original foundations have been completely lost. Other values instead simply present themselves as a means to ensure a genuine form and steadfastness. Courage, loyalty, lack of deviousness, an aversion to falsehood, an incapacity to betray and superiority vis-à-vis any selfish pettiness or lowly interest may be counted among those values which, in a way, transcend good and evil, as they are situated on an ontological rather than moral level, precisely because they bestow or strengthen being, by contrast to the condition represented by a feeble, elusive and shapeless nature. No imperative applies here. The individual's natural disposition is what counts. To use a simile, nature presents both substances which are fully crystallized and ones which are imperfect and incomplete crystals, mixed with crumbly gang. Certainly, we will not call the former good and the latter bad in a moral sense. They present different degrees of reality. The same holds true for human beings. The problem of young people's development and of their love for self-discipline must be approached on this level, above all criteria and values related to social morality. F. Thies has justly written, "There are vulgarity, meanness, baseness, bestiality and perfidy, just as there are the stupid practices of virtue, bigotry and conformist respect for the law. The former are worth as little as the latter." Generally speaking, young people are characterized by an overflow of energy. Thus the problem emerges of what use this can be put to in a world such as ours. In this respect, one may first of all consider the fostering of the process of development on the physical level. Here I can hardly recommend any modern sport at all. Indeed, sport is one of the leading causes of the degradation of the modern masses and almost inevitably has a vulgar character. However, some particular physical activities may be admitted. One example is high-altitude mountaineering, when it is brought back to its original form, without the technical aids and the tendency toward sheer acrobatics that have deformed it and stripped it of its spirit in recent times. Parachuting too can offer positive possibilities. In this case, as much as in the previous one, the risk factor is a useful support for inner strengthening. Another example might be Japanese martial arts, provided that there is the opportunity to learn them according to their original tradition and not in the forms which have become widespread in the West and which lack the spiritual counterpart that enable these activities to be closely associated with subtle forms of inner and spiritual discipline. In relatively recent times, various possibilities were offered by certain student corporations in Central Europe, the so-called core student for practicing mensur, cruel but non-fatal duels that followed specific rules, leaving facial scars as traces, with the goal of developing courage, steadfastness, intrepidity and endurance to physical pain, while at the same time upholding the values of a higher ethics, of honor and camaraderie, not without certain excesses. But as the corresponding socio-cultural contexts have disappeared, something of this sort is quite unthinkable today, especially in Italy. This overflow of energy may also lead to various forms of activism in the socio-political sphere. In these cases, what is required first of all is serious self-examination, to ascertain that a possible engagement with ideas opposed to the general climate may not simply be a means to release such energy, in which case, under different circumstances, even very different ideas might serve the same purpose. The starting point and driving force must rather be a true identification with these ideas, based on a thoughtful acknowledgement of their intrinsic value. Apart from this, in the case of activism a further difficulty emerges, for although the type of youth I have been referring to may have clearly discerned what ideas are worth fighting for, he could hardly find any fronts, parties or political groups which truly and staunchly defend ideas of that sort in the current climate. Another circumstance, namely the fact that the stage we have reached makes it unlikely for the struggle against currently dominant political and social movements to achieve any appreciable general results, ultimately has little weight. The norm here should be to do what must be done, while remaining ready to fight, even to fight, if necessary, a losing battle. At any rate, it will always be useful to affirm a certain presence today, even by means of action. As for the sort of anarchist activism that constitutes a mere act of protest, this could range from the kind of violent demonstrations that are commonly described as hooliganism, such as those held by young people in certain countries. I have already mentioned the case of Northern European countries, where welfare society is the rule, to terrorist acts, such as those once used by nihilist, political anarchists. Leaving aside the motives of certain beats, which is to say their desire to carry out violent actions simply for the thrill of it, such activism seems quite pointless even simply as a means to release energy. Certainly, if it were possible to set up a sort of holy vein today, so as to keep the main culprits of contemporary subversion in a constant state of physical insecurity, it would be an excellent thing. But this is not something which the youth can organize, and, besides, the defense system of contemporary society is too well built for such initiatives not to be quashed from the start and paid for at too high a price. It is worth considering one last point. In the category of young people that we are presently discussing and who may be described as right-wing anarchists in relation to the contemporary milieu, we find some individuals who at the same time are seriously drawn towards the prospects of spiritual realization brought to their attention by earnest representatives of the traditionalist movement, with reference to ancient lore and initiatory doctrines. This is something more serious than the aforementioned ambiguous interest exerted by the irrationalism of a misunderstood Zen among certain American beats, not least because of the different quality of the sources of information. Such an attraction is understandable, considering the spiritual vacuum that has been created by the decadence of the religious forms once dominant in the West, and the questioning of their value. It is not inconceivable that, once removed from these, young people may aspire toward something truly superior, rather than any worthless substitutes. Nonetheless, our aspirations with regard to the youth must not be too ambitious and removed from reality. Not only is a certain degree of maturity required, but one must also bear in mind that the path which I have also outlined in previous chapters, 11 and 15, requires, and has always required, special qualifications and something akin to what is known as a vocation among religious orders. As is well known, in such orders the novice is allowed a certain amount of time to ascertain just how genuine his vocation is. Here I must repeat what I have stated before concerning the more general vocation that one may experience as a youth. It is necessary to see whether it will grow weaker or stronger with the passing years. The doctrines to which I have referred must not give rise to the kind of illusions upheld by many spurious forms of contemporary neo-spiritualism, theosophy, anthroposophy, etc., which is to say, to the idea that the highest goal is within everyone's reach and realizable by this or that expedient. Rather, it should appear as a distant mountain range, to be reached only through a long, difficult and dangerous trek. Certain preliminary tasks of considerable import nonetheless provide a real prospect for those nurturing a genuine interest. First of all, they should devote themselves to a series of studies concerning the general view of life and of the world which constitutes the natural counterpart to such doctrines, so as to acquire a new outlook, positively reinforcing the no they utter in the face of everything that exists today, and eliminating the many and severe forms of intoxication arising from modern culture. The second phase, the second task, would be to surpass the merely intellectual level by lending organic form to a certain set of ideas, in such a way that it may determine a fundamental existential orientation and thereby engender a permanent and unwavering sense of security. Any youths that had gradually attained as much would have already gone a very long way. They could leave the question of the if and when of the third phase undecided, in which, with the enduring of the original tension, one may attempt certain actions that are deconditioning with respect to human limits. Imponderable factors come into play here, and the only sensible aim to pursue is an adequate preparation. It would be absurd to expect any immediate results in a youth. Various personal experiences of mine confirm the relevance of these final brief considerations and clarifications, which obviously concern a highly differentiated group within nonconformist youth, the group of those who have come to perceive the strictly spiritual problem within its appropriate framework. These considerations have brought us well beyond what is commonly called the problem of young people. The right-wing anarchist may be conceived as a fairly distinct and comprehensible type, in opposition to both the stupefied youth and the rebels without a flag, and to all those who embrace reckless living and undertake experiences that can provide no real solution, no positive contribution, unless one already possesses an inner form. Strictly speaking, one could object that this form is a limitation, a bond which contradicts the initial aspiration, the absolute freedom of anarchism. However, it is highly unlikely that anyone formulating such an objection may do so by taking as his point of reference transcendence in the genuine and absolute sense of the term, the kind of sense, for example, it acquires in relation to hyacesis. Hence, one may reply that the other alternative concerns a youth that is so burned out that, as no significant core has survived the test represented by the general dissolution, it may well be regarded as a pure existential product of this very same dissolution. It is pure delusion for this youth to believe that it is really free. Such a youth, whether rebellious or not, is of very little interest to us, nor do we have anything to do with it. It can only serve as a case study within the overall framework of the pathology of an epoch.